Welcome to this YSL Excel VBA tutorial. This short video is all about using the switch function in your VBA code. The switch function is a lot like a succinct replacement for basic select case statements. So we're actually going to start with a reminder of how the select case statement works, just so that we've got an easy way to contrast the switch function with it. We'll then show you how you can convert a select case statement into a switch function, and then look at how you generate a user-defined function to return the results of your switch function. The last part of the video is going to use the switch function in a slightly more practical example by separating out a list of data into separate worksheets. So let's get started. Let's start with a quick reminder of how the select case statement works in VBA. This will be a nice contrast between select case and the switch function. So what we'll do is we'll categorize our list of films based on how long they last in minutes. If you need this data set, by the way, there'll be a link in the video description that you can use to download the workbook. So what we'll do is we'll categorize films based on their length in minutes. So for instance, we'll say things like if it's 90 minutes or less, it's short, between 90 and 120 minutes, it's medium, and so on. So we'll create 4 or 5 different categories. So to get started with that, let's head to the VB editor by pressing Alt and F11, and then we can insert a new module in the usual way. And we'll start with a quick subroutine called basic select case. So what we can do in here, we could use an if-else-if statement as well, I suppose, to do this exact same thing, but I think switch is more equivalent to select case in terms of the way that it operates. So let's have a quick look at saying dim runtime as integer, which will hold the runtime in minutes. Then we'll say dim length as string, which will hold the category for the film. We can then say, let's say something simple like range a2.select, so we've got a cell selected that's got a film name in it to begin with, and then we can say runtime equals active cell dot offset 0,3 dot value. So the runtime is 3 columns to the right from the cell in column A from the film's name. Okay, so a select case statement. If you haven't dealt with select case statements already, we do have a video on select case as part of the main Excel VBA introduction series. So it's video number 14. So do feel free to have a quick watch of that one if it's select case statements that you're particularly interested in. This one's just mainly for a quick way to compare select case with switch. So we're not going to go into too much detail here. I'll stop butchering on. Let's say select case of runtime, and then I'll end up with end select. I'll type that in just so that I don't forget at the end. And then I can say case is less than or equal to 90 to begin with. If that's true, what I would like to do is say that length equals, and then I can put in the word short. And then what I'm going to do, I was going to say cheat, it's not really cheating. If it speeds up what you're doing, it's just being efficient in my book. So not cheating, being efficient. Let's just paste that in a few times. So we can then change the numbers and then change the description. So if it's less than 120, it's medium. Less than 150, beg pardon, less than 150, it will be long. And then less than 180, it will be, let's say, epic. And then one final one, what we're going to do here is say case else. So for every other possibility, we'll say that length equals, I don't know, snooze fest, too long, bring a pillow, I don't know, make up your own description if you really, really want to. Really quick description or really quick explanation, appreciating that all films will be, well, most films will be less than or equal to 180 minutes. The way select case works is that the first category that a value falls into, so if the value is less than or equal to 90 minutes, the film will be considered short and the remaining conditions aren't evaluated. So as long as you structure your case statements in the correct order, things will work properly. Just to demonstrate that, let's have a quick debug.print, which will make information appear in the immediate window. We'll say debug.print runtime, comma, length. So for Jurassic Park, which was the first film in the list, which was cell A2, that's got a runtime of 126 minutes. So if I were to run that subroutine, 126 comes out as long. So it's essentially, it's not less than or equal to 120, but it is less than or equal to 150, in which case that film becomes long. We can happily test this for other films, so let's go for Spider-Man, which is cell A3. That's going to fall into the same category. Let's go for A4 instead. King Kong, 187 minutes. So we'll go for A4 and then run that one again. That's definitely a snooze. That's a dreadful film. Snooze fest. That was so boring. Anyway, good. So that's our basic select case statement working. Now there's absolutely nothing wrong with select case per se. It does the job that we've asked it to and we've got the right results. It's just that it's quite a lot of code to write to do something quite so simple as generating a basic text value from a numeric value. Switch functions do the exact same job in a much shorter, more succinct way. So let's in fact just copy and paste this entire subroutine, and then we can change its name so that it's called something like basic switch. And then, excuse me, I'll spell switch properly. What we can do is replace the entire select case statement with a reference to the switch function instead. Now the idea behind the switch function is that it returns a value, it returns a piece of text, or it returns a number, or it returns a date. It's not a case of asking it to perform an instruction, so we're not going to write inside the switch function if this condition is true, then length equals something. We're going to begin our expression by saying length equals, and then it will be the result of our switch function. Now the parameter list for the switch function isn't massively useful. It just says parameter, then variable expression as variant. So essentially what we need to do here is write out a sequence of logical tests with the true part, the answer if that logical test returns true. So the arguments for a switch function should be entered in pairs. So a test, answer, etc. So just to get started with that, and to help us out with copying and pasting, I'm going to put in a space underscore, and then I'm going to say runtime less than or equal to 90. So that's the exact same first logical test. If I then type in a comma and then say what value I'd like that to have, that's going to be short. Technically, if I were to wrap up the closed parentheses there, that's a perfectly valid switch function. If I were to run this one with King Kong selected, I end up with a runtime error because essentially the function returns null. I haven't written a valid return value for 187 minutes. So be careful of making sure that you always have or cater for every individual possibility. So what we'll do is we'll carry on writing this. I'm just going to get rid of the round brackets there, the closed round brackets, and finish that with a comma space underscore. And then if I were to copy that line, and again paste it in a few times, let's say I've got 4 copies, so then I can say runtime is less than or equal to 120, and that'll be medium. And then if it's 150 or less, then that'll be long. Then that will be 180, and that will be epic. And then for the very final category, I've got a couple of choices here. I could say runtime is greater than 180 to write the explicit test. But the idea behind a switch function is that each of these logical tests is trying to evaluate to the result true. Now if I've structured my set of conditions appropriately, there shouldn't be any possibility of the runtime being anything other than greater than 180. So you could just shortcut this, state true, and then put in snoozefest as the result, or whatever other category you want, and then finally at that point we've got every possible condition handled. So were I to run this one now, rather than getting a runtime error, because King Kong 187 minutes fails all of the other tests, it falls straight through into the true, the final pair of arguments, the true and the snoozefest. If I switch this back to say Jurassic Park, which was 126 minutes, that becomes long. I shouldn't have clicked into that part of the immediate window. Let's just do that again so you can see that clearly. Beg pardon, I'll get there eventually. That becomes long, and likewise each of the other films will fall into the appropriate category. Let's see, can we pick a particularly short one? Number 25 there, so let's say a 25, and then run that one as well, so that becomes short. So you can see that everything is falling into the correct category. And the basic advantage of having a switch function over a select case statement is how much less code there is to write. As you can see here, compare that set of lines with the basics of the switch function. Now we could do a few different practical things with this particular switch function. We could use it to populate cells in the worksheet, so it could write out a description for each film into a new column, or we could use it to create a user-defined function that we could then write into various parts of a worksheet or use in other parts of our code. We could even write a subroutine that separates out all of our films by length and copies each film into a separate worksheet based on which category it falls into. We can do all those things, and let's maybe start with a quick simple function to start with. Let's create a new function called film length, and what this is going to do is accept a number or an integer. So I'm going to say let's call it I as integer. It doesn't really matter what the parameter name is called. I as integer, and it's going to return a string. So what we can do then is copy the entire function that we've just written and then paste that in to the function we're generating. Maybe I'll call, just for saving a bit of time, rather than calling the parameter I, we'll call it runtime instead, just that I don't have to change anything about this. The name of the function is called film length, so that means that I need to return a value to film length to actually make the function do something useful. Then if I can clear the contents of the immediate window and just give this a really quick simple test, I can say question mark film length and then pass in, say, I don't know, the number 125. Doesn't really matter, just to test that it works. I get long. 156, I should get epic. 140, I ought to get long. Oops, a little bit too long. There we go, 140. Long, etc., etc. So basically we're converting the expression into a reusable function, and I can now use that in various parts of my worksheet. So I could head into my worksheet and I could write into column L. I could say equals film length. You may have written user-defined functions before, and if I can reference a cell here, runtime in minutes, and close the parentheses and then hit enter, that will generate the correct answer. I can copy that formula down the list. It'll take a little time to process, as user-defined functions do, but eventually I'll get the appropriate description for each individual film. I could even reuse that function in my code, so rather than writing out the switch function inside this subroutine here, I could instead call it. So I could say, rather than length equals switch, I could say length equals film length and then pass in the runtime, or the value stored in my runtime variable. So again, that will do the exact same thing. If I were to run that subroutine at that point, I'll get 89 short. Let me clear the contents of the immediate window, and so on and so on. So each time I run that, it will give me a different result based on different cells. If I wanted to use that function to separate out the films based on their length, I've got a little more work to do. I'm going to start by just deleting all the formulae that I've typed into column L. So I'm going to click into cell L2, press Ctrl Shift and the down arrow key, and then just hit the delete key on the keyboard to clear their contents. What I'm then going to do is write some code that will loop through this entire range of films and work out which length category the film falls into, and copy that data out into a new worksheet. I want to make sure that I've written code that's going to generate the new worksheet as well. So let's just head into a new module for this. I'll leave that function sitting where it is. I can still call it from my other modules, that's fine. The main routine is going to be something like sub list films by length. And then the main idea here is that I'm going to loop through all the cells in column A of my sheet 1. So I'm going to say dim r as range, and then the main loop will be for each r in range. I should refer to the correct worksheet, as I'm going to be copying or creating lots of new sheets as well. So I'm going to say for each r in sheet 1 dot range, the top cell will be cell A2, and the bottom cell will be sheet 1 dot range A1 dot end XL down. So that's just a quick simple way to refer to the entire range of populated cells in column A, except for the column heading. I don't care about that one. And I can say next R. I want to read in the runtime for each film, so let's have a variable here called dim runtime, just as we did earlier, dim runtime as integer. And from there I can say runtime equals r.offset 0,3.value. Alternatively, what I could have done there, rather than read the runtime into a variable first, I could have just calculated the film length by passing that value into the function. So rather than saying runtime as integer, let's call it length as string. And then what I can do here is say length equals, excuse me, I'll get there eventually, length equals, and then I can simply call my function film length, open some parentheses, it's asking for the runtime as integer, so I can then just wrap that up in a set of round brackets, and that will calculate the correct length. The next job then is to copy that row of data into the correct worksheet. But the problem here, of course, is that those worksheets don't yet exist. So we could create those worksheets manually, although that seems a little bit boring. It's much more interesting to do it in code. So what we should do is write some code that either creates a new worksheet from scratch if it doesn't exist with the appropriate name, or if it does already exist, just clear its current contents so that we can replace them with this new set of films. So there's a few different ways we could approach this. Here's the approach I'm going to take. I'm going to start by declaring an array that's going to hold a list of the sheet names I would like to create. So I'm going to call this something like sheet names, and it's going to be an empty array without a type, so it'll be a variant array. What I can then do is populate that array by saying sheet names equals array, and then inside some round brackets I can write out the individual names that I would like this array to hold. These are going to be equal to the values that are returned by my switch function, or by my film length function. So I'm just going to write these out by hand. I'm going to say short, then medium, which is the tedious bit of course, medium, long, epic, and then finally snooze fest. Okay, so those are the variables, or those are the values I'd like to hold in the array. What I would then like to do is loop over the contents of that array to create each sheet one by one. So I'm going to declare another variable to do that. I'm going to say dimv as variant, which will allow me to loop over the elements of that array. All these techniques, by the way, that we're looking at here, we're covering in a lot more detail in other videos in this series. So if you wanted more information on arrays or loops or the next little bit that we're going to cover, then have a look at the other videos in the series for the detail on this. So the loop I'm going to write here is going to be another for each loop. It'll be for each v in sheet names, and then I can say next v. And inside that loop, what I would like to be able to do is call another routine that will try to either clear or create the sheet I'm interested in. So to do that, we'll need another subroutine that we can call that will create the appropriate sheet. Let's scroll down towards the bottom of this module and create a new sub called something like create length sheet. Now this subroutine is going to need a parameter into which we can pass the name of the sheet that we're trying to create. So I'm going to call this one something like sheet name as string, and it's really important that we pass this one in by val rather than the default in VBA, which is by ref. And again, if you're interested in what that means, then we have a video that describes in huge amounts of boring detail what by val and by ref mean. Just for this video, just be aware that this is essential based on the way that we're passing the information into this procedure using an array. So once I've got to that stage, the first thing I would like to try to do is just clear all the cells that currently exist on a worksheet with that name. So I can do that by saying worksheets, and then in the parentheses refer to the sheet name that I've just passed in. Then I can say .cells.clear, which if the sheet does exist, will clear them all out. If that sheet doesn't exist, then it's going to throw a runtime error. So one neat way to check whether the sheet exists and to take a different action if that's the case is to use an onError statement, so a little tiny bit of error handling. I'm going to say onError go to create sheet, that's going to be my label. Then I'm going to copy that label name and paste it in towards the bottom of the procedure and immediately type in a colon after its name. So if I reach this stage, it means that that line has failed. So that means that I can write a statement here that will say worksheets.add. And once you add a worksheet using the add method, it also returns a reference to that sheet. So I can access its name property immediately and try to make its name equal to the value of the sheet name that I've passed in here. So I can say sheet name. What I would like to do after I've created the sheet is return to the next line of code after the one that generated the error, and I can do that by saying resume next. The very next line of code I'd like to execute is to turn off my custom error handler, so I'm going to say onError go to 0, which is a slightly bizarre line to write, but that's what you have to do to switch off a custom error handler. And then finally I can just copy the column headings from sheet 1 into the new worksheet that's just been created, or the old sheet that's just been cleared. So to do that, I can say sheet1.range a1, comma, sheet1.range, excuse me, that was meant to be a full stop rather than a comma, sheet1.range a1.end xl2 right, So this is just making sure that I copy the entire row of column headings regardless of how many columns I have in the data at that time. So I can say sheet1.range A1, A1 Excel to right, dot copy, and the location that I'd like to paste that into or copy it to is Worksheets sheet name, excuse me, I'll get there eventually, sheet name dot range A1. One final thing to do in this particular procedure, and that's to write a quick exit sub, just to make sure that the code doesn't then continue and follow the instructions in the error handling section again. So to make all that work, let's just check that it is going to work. I'm going to comment out my for each loop, which loops over the range of cells on sheet 1, and then let's just call my create length sheet routine. I'm going to say create length sheet and then pass into that the value stored in my variant variable. So if I were to run this subroutine at this point, I ought to end up with a great big long list of new worksheets. When I say a great big long list, I should end up with 5 new worksheets, each with the correct name based on the values stored in my array. Okay, so that's most of the hard work done at this point. All we need to do now is make sure that we copy the appropriate row of data into the appropriate worksheet, whose name we've already calculated inside our for each loop. So let's just uncomment that little loop that we commented out earlier on. We need to make sure that we're only copying the correct columns of cells, or we could copy just the entire row, but that's a little bit excessive. If you ask me, it's about 16,500 columns, which is a little bit more than we really need. So one neat little technique, although we could just use the same technique we use for the column headings using the end Excel to right method, but just for a slight bit of variety, what I'm going to do in this case is declare a new variable which holds the number of columns in our data set. So I'm going to say dim cols as integer. Then before I do anything else, I'm going to say cols equals sheet1.range A1.currentRegion dot columns dot count. So that will just tell us how many columns there are in that table of data. And that makes it kind of nice and easy to copy the appropriate range of cells. So once I've calculated the correct film length, essentially that's the name of the worksheet I'm going to copy it to, I'm now going to say r.resize, and I'm going to say that the number of rows I want to resize to is 1 row in height. The number of columns is equal to cols. So in this case it'll be 11 columns, that's how many cells are currently populated, or how many columns are currently populated. But if we decide to grow or shrink our table of data, this code will still work. I'm going to say that I want to copy that row of data, and the destination is going to be, first of all, the appropriate worksheet. So worksheets length. So the name of the sheet is held in the length variable, calculated by our film length function. I could have just copied that entire function into the worksheets property, so there's actually no need really to have this separate length variable. It just makes this line of code a little tiny bit more elegant, a little bit easier to read and write. So worksheets length dot, and I want to refer to the next available blank cell in column A. One way to do that, not necessarily the best, but one way to do it is to say range A 1,048,576 dot end XL up dot offset 1, 0. So that will refer to the next blank cell in column A. That's assuming that you're using a version of Excel from Excel 2007 onwards. If you're still in Excel 2003, and hopefully you're not, but if you're in Excel 2003, that won't work. The number of rows is 65,536 for Excel 2003. Last tiny little thing to do, just for a bit of tidying up, bearing in mind that if we're creating new sheets, their column widths will be a bit too narrow to read the data. I'm going to loop over that same array of sheet names again, and rather than saying create length sheet, I'm going to say worksheets v dot range A1 dot current region dot entire column this time, dot entire column dot auto fit, and that'll just make sure that all the columns are the correct width for the data that we've pasted into those rows. Okay, so that's basically the entire procedure done. Let's just do a tiny bit more tidying up, and then let's run the entire thing just to make sure that we end up with a great big long list of different films separated by length. So once the loop is finished, And just about there it looks like. We should find if we switch back into the worksheet, have a quick look on each of these individual sheets, we've got our films separated out by their different lengths. Maybe Snooze Fest was a bit of a poor name for the category. There's some quite good films there. There are some equally poor films in that list there though as well, but I suppose that's going to be true for most of the categories. So feel free to have a quick flick through and see if you agree with the categorization. Okay, so not particularly complex ideas. The main point I was trying to get across here with this example is that the switch function is a beautiful, succinct replacement for long-winded select case statements. How you go about using your switch functions in your own code is entirely up to you, but hopefully you got at least one basic idea with this practical example. Thanks for watching. See you next time. If you like what you've seen here, why not head over to the WiseOwl website where you can find loads more free resources, including these videos, some written blogs and tutorials, and even some exercises that you can download to practice your skills. Thanks for watching, see you next time.